Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. My name's Megan Churchwell and I'm the curator of the Puget Sound Navy Museum. I know in these unprecedented times there's been a lot of talk about how our world is going through immense changes very quickly as we mobilize to fight COVID-19. So today I wanted to take us back to another era when Bremerton residents experienced quite a lot of change in a short time and came together to fight a common cause. So today I'll be sharing a bit about Bremerton and the Puget Sound Navy Yard during the World War II years. Both the shipyard and the city of Bremerton experienced dramatic changes during World War II, and every resident, whether a student, a shipyard employee, a restaurant server, a sailor, or a homemaker, was impacted by their wartime experience. Though no battles were fought on the American mainland, of course, the war affected all aspects of American life. And as you will see, Bremerton's Puget Sound Navy Yard played a significant role in the construction, repair, overhaul, and maintenance of U.S. Navy ships during World War II. Both the Puget Sound Navy Yard and the city of Bremerton were undeniably different at the end of the war than they'd been at the start. The war ended the Great Depression, promoted growth in the shipyard and surrounding city, and created a feeling of solidarity among residents tied together by the spirit of sacrifice, that we were all in it together. In 1940, as the war expanded in Europe, even though the U.S. was still officially considered a neutral country, the Puget Sound Navy Yard was already contributing to the war effort. Here, 6,000 workers overhauled 2 battleships and 3 cruisers. 2 new dry docks were constructed in the buildup leading to American entry in the war. The Puget Sound Navy Yard's early wartime contributions also included the production of ships to help the British fend off Germany, built under the Lend-Lease Act. While unemployment in the rest of the country ranged from 12 to as high as 20% as the 1930s drew to a close, an effect of the Great Depression, in Bremerton it was just 6.9%, reflecting the growing importance of the shipyard. And even before Pearl Harbor, these employment numbers began to grow. Shipyard employment doubled over the last 6 months of 1941. And again, this is still before America had even entered the war. The arrival of thousands of servicemen, some accompanied by their families, brought a flood of business to Bremerton in the months before we officially entered the war. For many Bremerton residents, however, the war still seemed far away. They read the newspaper headlines and heard the radio bulletins, but the war had not directly affected their lives. Still, signs of the growing wartime industry were starting to show up in Bremerton. And soon, of course, we would play a more active role in the war effort. On December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor, and America officially entered into World War II. Our world changed dramatically in the span of a single morning. On the home front, patriotism surged as the entire nation joined the fight. The Navy Yard reacted swiftly to news of the attack, quickly mobilizing in support of a total war effort. After the attack at Pearl Harbor, many Bremerton residents feared a Pacific Coast attack was next. They worried that the Puget Sound Navy Yard's facilities would be viewed as an important strategic target. It might seem strange in hindsight, but at the time, there was a very real fear that Bremerton would be the next to be hit. Shipyard employees immediately began securing both the shipyard and the city of Bremerton for that possibility, bracing for expected air attacks and invasion. There were blackouts and dim-outs. Gas masks and air raid instructions were issued. Smoke screens created by smudge pots, oil burners designed to release thick clouds of dark smoke, periodically blanketed Bremerton and the Navy Yard. Air raid shelters were constructed and placed strategically around the shipyard grounds, and camouflage kept planes overhead from recognizing shipyard landmarks. Hundreds of barrage balloons moored on both land and water deterred dive bombing. These large balloons were anchored by thick anchor cables, designed for approaching aircraft to become tangled and disabled. In those days, everyone knew a friend of a friend whose chimney had been taken out by a barrage balloon that had come unmoored during high winds. For shipyard workers who lived in Seattle, traveling by ferry became more difficult after the installation of a pair of steel-cabled nets to prevent the unauthorized passage of submarines or surface ships. A trip to Seattle now meant waiting as one net, then the other, was lowered to allow the ferry safe passage. After the Pearl Harbor attack, Puget Sound Navy Yard employees stood ready to assist with the salvage and repair operations. Dozens of shipyard employees traveled to Pearl Harbor in the immediate aftermath of the attack. And meanwhile, the Navy Yard itself began preparing for its role in repairing the damaged ships. As the only battleship repair yard on the West Coast, shipyard employees knew they would have work to do as soon as the damaged ships could get underway. And in fact, Bremerton Shipyard would serve as the main repair facility for 5 American battleships that survived the Japanese attack. They were USS Tennessee, Maryland, Nevada, California, and West Virginia. These 5 were nicknamed the Ghost Fleet because though Japan had declared them sunk in the surprise attack, they returned to service and came back to haunt the Japanese fleet for the rest of the war. Repairing these heavily damaged ships created a workload that would last for 30 months. Once war was declared, the shipyard began operating around the clock. During the war, its main mission was to repair Pacific Fleet warships that had been damaged in battle. Shipyard workers turned their attention towards repairing and overhauling those ships so they could return to service as quickly as possible. The shipyard began relying on techniques like prefabrication to speed up the repair process. USS New Orleans is my favorite example of the shipyard using prefabricated materials to repair a ship. On November 30th, 1942, USS New Orleans lost her entire bow. After stopping in Sydney, Australia to have a temporary one installed, New Orleans made her way to Bremerton, where a new one had been built for her using plans from her sister ship USS Astoria. When New Orleans arrived at the shipyard, it was discovered that the new bow was out of line by only 1/8 of an inch. Soon, USS New Orleans was as good as new. With the significantly increased workload came a labor shortage. The pre-World War II workforce numbered around 10,000. Starting in 1943, a nationwide recruitment campaign encouraged Americans to come to Bremerton and join the shipyard. Heeding the call, as many as 300 potential new hires arrived every single day. Opportunity brought new residents to Bremerton from all over the United States. Some had never even seen the ocean before, and they marveled at the huge ships docked here. There were jobs for anyone who wanted one. At the Navy Yard, 32,000 workers fueled the war effort by 1945. And of course, many of these new employees were women. With the outbreak of war, thousands of American men joined the armed forces and headed into battle. Their civilian jobs were now left open, and women began securing positions as welders, electricians, and riveters in defense plants. A woman who toiled in the defense industry came to be known as Rosie the Riveter, a term popularized by a 1942 hit song of the same name. By 1944, women made up more than a quarter of the workforce at the shipyard. Entire families worked in the yard, sometimes as many as 3 generations at once. Many were the mothers and wives of soldiers and sailors. Other women were themselves members of the armed forces. Though most women in the defense industry were civilians, some had enlisted in the Navy as waves, or women accepted for volunteer emergency service. And there were approximately 250 waves stationed here in Bremerton during World War II. High school students also comprised a significant portion of the shipyard's labor force. By 1941, the influx of families attracted here by the promise of shipyard work overwhelmed Bremerton High School, forcing students to attend in split shifts. Those attending school during the morning shift, 8 a.m. to noon, often rushed to work at the shipyard or local businesses after school. Meanwhile, almost all of the boys from Bremerton High School's classes of 1941 through 1945 went into the service. During the war, Bremerton's population tripled in just a 3-year period, bringing thousands of new residents to the city. Bremerton in 1940 was a relatively modest town of around 15,000 people. But by war's end, some estimates placed Bremerton's population as high as 80,000. The town was flooded with war workers, sailors, and soldiers. There were government-financed housing developments, but even with federal money coming in for war worker housing, it was never enough. Town residents made room for workers in their homes and garages, but housing demands remained so great that workers also lived in tents, trailers, cars, and in some cases even quickly converted chicken coops. This influx of wartime workers also overwhelmed existing restaurants and cafeterias. During a single month, July of 1944, workers ate an estimated 507,000 meals at the shipyard. That's more than 16,000 meals served every day. To deal with the shortage, 2 Northern Pacific Railroad passenger cars, nicknamed the Feed Bag and the Ritz, served as rolling cafeterias, offering a fast, cheap lunch solution. The hustle and bustle in Bremerton during the war years even included 2 visits by President Roosevelt. On September 22, 1942, he visited the Puget Sound Navy Yard during a secret tour of defense plants and military bases. Though he was seen by thousands of workers during his stop here, they were asked to keep quiet for several weeks for security reasons. And amazingly, they actually succeeded in keeping it quiet. Roosevelt returned to Bremerton on August 12, 1944, for a second, more publicized wartime visit. War bonds were another important aspect of Bremerton's contributions to the war effort. By the fall of 1941, the shipyard's newsletter, The Salute, started running advertisements encouraging employees to buy defense bonds. A December 1941 issue even stated that bonds would make great Christmas gifts. Servicemen and civilians alike showed their patriotism in the purchase of war bonds, loaning their personal money to the government to finance the war. From 1941 to 1945, Navy Yard employees pledged more than $44 million. A 1943 bond-selling competition pitted the Puget Sound Navy Yard against California's Mare Island Navy Yard. At a massive rally held that spring at the shipyard, film star Ginger Rogers urged more than 10,000 Navy Yard employees to buy war bonds. Bremerton won the competition, and USS Bremerton, a heavy cruiser, was named after the city in recognition of their substantial contributions to the war effort. Of course, shipyard employees contributed much more than money to the war effort. The shipyard buzzed with activity 24/7. Though workers were told not to talk about their work when outside the shipyard gates, their construction and repair records were no secret. Above the joiner shop entrance, a large sign listed the numbers and types of ships built and repaired here during World War II. And as you can see, their dedication to production for victory was no empty promise. In total, they repaired 26 battleships, some more than once, along with 18 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and 79 destroyers. They also built 53 entirely new vessels, including 5 aircraft carriers and 13 destroyers. There was new construction, post-battle repairs, routine maintenance, and extensive overhauls, all happening here. In addition, they also overhauled, repaired, or fitted out another 400 smaller vessels during the 44 months of war. The shipyard's contributions enabled the Pacific Fleet to participate in crucial naval battles and ultimately to win the war in the Pacific. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered, followed by Japan's surrender on August 14th. And here in Bremerton, the occasion of VJ Day was marked by the wailing of fire truck sirens and the honking of car horns. Shredded paper confetti fluttered from top windows onto streets packed with shouting workers. Bremerton's ferries faced a huge challenge as waiting lines zigzagged back and forth on sidewalks and streets between the Navy Yard and the ferry terminal. 2 shifts of workers rushing home at the same time created the biggest traffic jam the city had ever seen. Almost immediately, rationing stopped and war industries like the shipyard slashed their workforce. Many workers actually welcomed this time off. They'd worked 6 days a week for several years, and they were ready for a break. Within just a week of Japan's surrender, hundreds of shipyard workers began quitting their jobs to return to their civilian careers, eager for a return to normalcy. By 1946, the shipyard's workforce had dropped to 9,000, from a wartime high of 32,000. But the yard's wartime job wasn't over quite yet. After the official end of the war, suddenly the yard had a new mission, codenamed Magic Carpet. There were thousands of American soldiers and sailors in Europe and across the Pacific theater. Warships were quickly converted into troop transports to bring them home. World War II had defined Bremerton, putting both the city and the shipyard on the map. Nothing in the city's past had prepared it for the scope of demands that arrived with the war, and no event to the present day has compared. Since the end of the war, the Puget Sound Navy Yard, which has since renamed Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, has remained one of the Navy's busiest shipbuilding and repair facilities. If you'd like to hear more about how the shipyard has affected the city of Bremerton over its long history, be sure to visit the Puget Sound Navy Museum when we reopen. Our first floor galleries are all about the history of the shipyard. And of course, I'm also happy to answer any questions you may have. Feel free to reach out through Facebook anytime. Thank you.